Hello friends, my name's Ty, and I'm going to read to you. I'm quite certain this will be the last video I'm able to put out before Halloween, so I've got another, hopefully, creepy one for you. This is called A Black Page Stained Red. Kevin Black crumpled a sheet of paper in his hand and tossed it onto the table in disgust. Why his agent insisted on sending him a handwritten letter every time another publisher gave his work the toss was still a mystery to him. The idea, he supposed, was to add some kind of human connection to muffle the horrid pain of rejection, but a shit sandwich tasted the same whether it was delivered via email or on textured paper. What did it say? Beth asked as she stood with her arms folded at the entrance to the kitchen. Kevin picked up the crumpled paper, rubbed it vigorously on his crotch, then threw it back on the table. That good, huh? She stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, her long dark hair like silk on the side of his face as she struck her slender chin over his shoulder. Don't let it make you miserable, okay? He turned in her grip and hugged her back. Don't let it make me miserable. I haven't sold anything in almost 2 years, and that's the sixth publisher to wipe their collective asses with my manuscript and tell me to go pound sand. He sighed and rested his cheek against her head. I'm well past the point of misery and moving into complete desperation. She disengaged herself from his grip and walked over to the china cabinet beside the kitchen table. You can't get discouraged, she said, and pulled open the bottom drawer. You just need to do something different. Something different? That's what I did this last story, and it has gone nowhere except for in the toilet. She rummaged around in the drawer, taking items out and setting them on the floor beside her. You were on top before, and you can get there again. You just need to change your approach. Kevin sighed and looked at the bookshelf on the opposite side of the kitchen table, beside his writing desk at the entrance to the wide living room. 4 books sat alone on the top shelf between obsidian bookends, each with his name on the spine, and each a work of fantastic horror, what his fans like to call the Black Pages. The first 3 had sold like they were going out of style, making Kevin enough money to quit his day job and allow him and Beth to buy their house. The 4th one, a departure from the first 3, had fallen flat, and had not even made enough money to pay out his advance. The new book had failed to catch the interest of any publisher, even when his agent suggested they offer to sign a contract with no advance at all. Now, he hadn't received a payday in over a year, and the coffers were starting to run dry. I think, Beth said, as she stood from the china cabinet, a small brown package in her hand, that you need to change your approach. So I got you this. She held out the package. Kevin accepted the offering. It was a rectangular box, roughly as long as his open hand, and wrapped in plain brown paper, with several stamps and postmarks on it. Their home address was written on the white stick-on tag in tall, looping letters. What's this? Kevin asked, turning the box over in his hands. Beth shrugged. I was hoping it was going to be a celebration present for when you sold the new book, but I think you could use it now. She rocked back and forth on her heels while she clasped her hands in front of her, biting her bottom lip. Go ahead. Open it. Sitting down at the kitchen table, Kevin eagerly lifted the taped-down flaps on either end of the package and pulled the paper off. Inside was a box made of dark brown wood with brass hinges on one side. Holding his breath, Kevin opened the box. Beneath the lid was a slender fountain pen. The tip looked like it was made of gold, and the shaft was made of a pale material that looked like ivory. Beside the pen were 2 unlabeled bottles of dark ink and a small folded piece of paper. He lifted the pen carefully and held it in the palm of his hand. It was smooth and heavy, and it felt good when he took up a writing grip. Where did you find this? Kevin asked as he held it up at eye level. The shaft was carved with elaborate Celtic knotwork, and it appeared to be handmade. Can we afford this? It must have cost a fortune. Beth shrugged and rocked back and forth on her heels again. I found it on the internet. The guy selling it must have been desperate for some cash because he let me grind him down to almost nothing with no arguing at all. I was just thinking about your first book and how you wrote it out longhand before typing it. If you try that again, get back to your roots, maybe you'll find your groove. Kevin set the pen carefully back in his box, then stood and hugged his wife. That is an amazing gift. Thank you. He kissed the first 2 fingers of her right hand, then placed them on the corner of her mouth, a gesture that went back to when they first started dating. I'm glad you like it, she said. He turned back to the pen and was about to pick it up again when his eye landed on the piece of folded paper. He picked it up and unfolded it, and found the same looping handwriting as on the package label. The note said, Do not make a signature with this pen. Then it will know your name. Kevin flipped the note over, looked at the blank back, and read it again. Wow, that's kind of creepy. Beth took the paper from him. That is creepy, she said, as her eyes flicked over the note. Who did you say you got it from? I don't know. It was someone in one of those want ad websites. I didn't get their name, just an identification number and an online payment account. Taking the note from Beth and making a derisive snort, Kevin dropped it on the table. I'm not worried, he said and picked up the pen. Probably just someone trying to be a freak. He ran his index finger over the elaborate knotwork. I have a feeling I'm going to do awesome things with this pen. In the small hours of the morning, Kevin shuffled carefully from the bedroom where Beth was sleeping and down the hallway. No matter how hard he looked, he could not find any sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, the collected worries that had been gathering around him for the last several months began dancing behind his eyelids like a bunch of drunken dwarves. He thought about watching television, but was afraid the noise would wake Beth. Instead, he sat down at his desk and flicked on the green-shaded lamp, spilling a warm pool of yellow light on the wooden surface. He reached out to tap the space bar of his keyboard, then paused when his eyes landed on the wooden box that Beth had given him. He opened the box and looked at the pen, pale and cool as it rested on the black felt interior. After a few moments, he picked it up, removed the nib, and carefully filled the barrel with ink from one of the small bottles. He flipped open the notebook that always sat at the corner of his desk and began to write. He started out just making a couple notes, a few ideas for a story. But soon, the ideas had turned into a good beginning, which in turn gave way to a middle and an end. The movement of the pen on the paper was smooth and crisp, and his handwriting took on an eloquent arch that he had never seen before. The pen fit his grip so well that it actually felt good to keep writing. He wrote, filling page after page, until he looked up with gritty eyes and saw the sky outside of the living room was starting to get light. He looked down on the page in front of him and wrote "The End" with a flourish. He set the pen carefully back in its box to flex his fingers, which were not at all stiff despite the hours of writing. His hand felt empty, diminished without the pen in it, and experienced a sharp reluctance as he closed the wooden lid. For a moment, he flipped through the pages of flowing script he'd just written, then shook his head. Strange, late-night ideas never turned out well. But he was sure the story would look like it should have been written in crayon when he read it over later. For now, he thought, he should try and get some sleep. He stood from his desk and padded back into his bedroom and slid into the warm bed beside the gentle curve of his wife. She made a soft noise in her throat and pushed her back against his chest. He breathed in the wonderful scent of her and fell asleep. When Kevin opened his eyes again, it was almost noon. The bed beside him was empty, and he stretched his limbs in all directions and grunted with the pleasure of it. He felt rested in a way that he had not experienced in several weeks, and he got out of bed without feeling like the world was going to shit on him. He walked down the hallway, scratching his head and thinking about bacon, and saw Beth sitting at his writing desk. She looked up from his notebook as he walked in the room. "When did you write this?" she asked. He leaned on the wall beside the desk and folded his arms. "Last night when I couldn't sleep." "Why? Is it awful?" "No," she said, and picked up the notebook. "This is amazing." "Really?" he asked, moving to stand beside her and look down at his work. She nodded. "It's like the stories you used to write when we were still in college, only with more polish. It's dark and scary." She looked down at the notebook, then back up at him. "It's really good." He picked up the notebook and flipped to the first page of the handwritten story. She was right, he saw when he started reading it. He had been one of his own toughest critics throughout his writing career, and even he thought it was good. After having a late breakfast with Beth, Kevin sat back down at his desk and transcribed the new story onto his computer. It hardly needed any editing, and he found he had made more errors with the keyboard than he did with the pen. Once he was done, and satisfied that the story was as good as it was going to get, he emailed it to his agent. An hour later, the phone rang. "Hi, Jimmy," he said, looking at the caller ID. "Where did this come from?" Jimmy asked. "Where did what come from?" "This story. It's awesome. Do you have any more?" "Not completed, but I've got a few ideas," Kevin said, and found that he did. Previously, he'd been afraid his creative well had run dry, and he could come up with nothing new, and had to try to wring out old ideas. But now he found that several stories and plot lines spun through his head so fast he could hardly keep track of them. His hand itched to take up the new pen and write. "Okay," Jimmy said on the other end of the phone. "You get to work. Let me know when you have a few more stories about this length. I've got an idea." After hanging up the phone, Kevin sat back at his desk, took his pen out of his box, and opened his notebook. For more than a week, he did nothing but write, stopping only to eat, sleep, and go to the stationery store for more notebooks. The stories literally fell out of the pen and onto the page with no resistance at all. The stories were dark and terrifying, setting scenes that he didn't even know he saw in his own head until they poured out onto the page. The work was something to be proud of, and he felt satisfied in a way he had not in a long, long time. At the end of the week, he had 10 stories completed, edited, and attached to an email that he sent to Jimmy. The next morning, his phone rang again. "Do you want the good news or the good news?" Jimmy asked. I'll take the good news, I guess," Kevin said. "I sent that first story to our old house, and they went nuts. When I sent the other 10, they were absolutely beside themselves. I've been talking to them all morning, and they want to publish the stories in a collection and sign you on for another novel. They've already sent me a contract." "Is it a good contract?" Kevin asked, remembering the last conversation he had with Jimmy about giving up on an advance. "It's amazing. Double your last advance." "Okay," Kevin said, feeling a smile spread on his face. "Let's do it. If you sign this, you have a year to produce the next novel. Can you do it?" Kevin looked down at his pen, sitting in its velvet box. "Yes, Jimmy, I can." Jimmy sent him a PDF of the contract, and Kevin printed it out. Beth opened a bottle of wine, and they sat at the kitchen table and drank together as Kevin read the contract over. "He's right," he said when he finished reading. "It's a good contract. It'll set us back on our feet again." "We were never off our feet," Beth said. "Now we're just up and running." "That we are," Kevin said, and clinked his glass against hers. He turned to the last page of the contract, picked up his lucky pen, and signed his name on the last line. As he was setting the pen back in the box, Beth said, "Uh-oh." "What?" "I think you got wine on the contract." Kevin turned back to the table and looked where her finger was pointing. At the end of his signature, where the K trailed off, there was a long smear of dark red. He shrugged. Not a big deal. That night, Kevin woke up with a brilliant idea burning in his mind. He had been playing with the idea of a noir detective story for his new novel, and the opening scene formed itself whole in his mind in that small space between asleep and awake. He slipped from the bed as quietly as he could and padded down the hallway to his writing desk. He sat down and picked up his pen. The shaft felt warm, inviting in his hand. He began to write out the beginning of the story, the lines pouring from the nib of the pen as though they had been trapped there all along and had just been waiting for him to happen by and shake them loose. The protagonist, a police detective, was called to a crime scene. A young woman had been murdered by a man the detective had hunted long ago. He knew it was the same man because the suspect left a signature, a verse drawn on the wall in the young woman's blood. "And you will know my name," the verse said. The prior cases involving the same suspect were never solved, and it haunted the aging detective for his entire career. Seeing the signature again, knowing he was close but could not identify the killer, tore him to pieces, almost drove him mad. Kevin closed the scene off with the detective staring into the young woman's face and picturing the faces of all the women the suspect had killed before. It was a fantastic opening, and he knew it would draw in anyone who read it. There were so many unanswered questions and so many places for the story to go. When he felt like he was done, he thought about going to bed. But it was full daylight out, so he went to the kitchen and made coffee instead. By the time the pot had brewed and he was setting cups on the counter, Beth walked sleepily down the hallway, pushing her disheveled hair from her face. She said, as she stopped and pecked him on the cheek. "I smell magic." He kissed her forehead and handed her a cup, then opened the fridge and began taking out ingredients for pancakes. "Did you go outside?" Beth asked. He stood up straight and looked over the top of the fridge door. "No. Why?" She was looking down at the floor, one hand on her hip, the other holding her coffee mug in front of her mouth. "You left muddy footprints on the floor. I just washed yesterday." "I didn't leave anything," he said, and closed the fridge. "I didn't go outside." "Then how do you explain this?" She pointed down with her free hand at a broad scuff of mud on the floor. "I don't know," he said. "You must have done it last night." "Right," she said, as she walked past him and gave him a smirk. "You can clean up your mess when you're done making me breakfast." She went into the living room and turned on the television. He looked down at the floor and studied the muddy mark. He frowned. something about the mark tickling in his mind, and then shrugged and went to the cupboard to pull out a measuring cup. "Oh my God," Beth said from the living room. "That's creepy." Kevin peeked from the entrance to the kitchen and looked at the television. "What's creepy?" "There was a murder in the city last night, and the suspect left some kind of weird signature on the wall. The reporter said the same message was left at a series of murders a couple years ago up north." The camera flashed across several police cars, lights flashing, and a stern-looking man in a uniform giving limited details to the reporter. The screen changed and another camera showed a brief shot through a window of a house that Kevin saw the word "name" before a burly policeman blocked the camera's view. Kevin felt himself go faint, and the measuring cup he was holding fell from nervous fingers to tumble to the floor. He leaned against the wall of the kitchen and struggled to keep himself upright. "Kevin?" Beth said, turning her seat on the couch. "Are you all right?" "My story," he said, and felt the faintness returning. "What is it?" She got up and walked quickly towards him, putting her arms around his waist. "What's the matter?" The thing on the news. It's just like my story." "What story?" "The one I wrote last night." Beth helped him to a chair, and then went to the writing desk and picked up his notebook, reading the pages quickly, then shook her head. "First of all, this is a brilliant opening," she said, setting the notebook back on her desk. "Second, it's only coincidence. A creepy coincidence, sure, but just a coincidence." He nodded, but it was several minutes before his hands would stop shaking. At the end of the day, after they had run errands, raked the leaves on the front lawn, watched a terrible romantic comedy on television, Beth yawned and announced she was going to bed. "Are you going to work for a while?" she asked. It was a long-running habit for him to do the better part of his writing at night, after she'd gone to sleep, and he nodded. "Yeah, I don't really feel like it, but I'll try and do something." Once she had gone down the hallway to their bedroom, he sat down at his desk and picked up his pen. His initial reluctance to work, brought on by the experience of seeing the crime scene on the news that nearly mimicked his story, fled as soon as the pen was in his hand. This time, the detective was in a bar, his favorite watering hole, closing the place down as he tried to drown his memories. Just as last call was sounded, a woman in the back of the bar screamed. The detective pulled his pistol and ran into the women's bathroom, where one woman was screaming and another was dead, hanging upside down from the toilet stall, her throat cut. On the mirror, in the victim's blood, were the words, "And my name is..." Kevin woke up when Beth touched the back of his neck. He sat upright and rubbed his face where he had been laying on his open notebook all night. "You slept at your desk?" Beth said, touching his face. "You haven't done that since our college days." I must have dozed off while I was writing," he said, and stretched his stiff arms above his head. "Go sit on the couch," Beth said. "I'll make you some coffee." He slouched his way over to the couch and fell into its soft embrace. He heard the coffee pot start percolating, then Beth opened the back door and began ruffling the weekend newspaper. "Ugh," she said after a moment. "There was another murder last night." "What?" he asked. "Where?" "In some bar downtown. A woman was found with her throat cut in the bathroom." The pain in his neck and his back forgotten, Kevin vaulted over the back of the couch and ran into the kitchen to snatch the paper from Beth's hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, as he scanned the front page. "Oh, dear God," he said, as he slumped down in a chair at the kitchen table. "It's the same thing again." "What is?" "The murder. It's the same as the scene in the story I wrote last night." Beth walked to his desk and picked up his notebook. As she read, he hoped she would protest, argue that he was wrong, but she only got pale. "Kevin," she said, as she put down the notebook, "what's going on?" "The pen," he said as he stood and looked down at it, where it sat shining in his box. "It's like it knows the murder is going to happen before it occurs." "Where did you say you got it from?" I don't know," she said, flapping her arms in exasperation. "I got it from some guy on the internet. He never gave me his name, just asked for a mailing address so he could send the pen to me after I bought it." "Email him again," he said, tapping the space bar on his computer. "Email him and ask him what the fuck is going on with his goddamn pen." Beth logged into her email account, found one of the emails she received from the pen's previous owner, and sent him a message, explaining that they'd had a few weird things happen, and asked if he experienced anything out of the ordinary. A handful of heartbeats after she hit send, a message popped up saying the email was undeliverable. She checked the address and sent it again. Once more, it bounced back. "What the hell is going on?" Kevin asked, grasping his hair and pacing beside the kitchen table. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation to all this," Beth said, standing and putting her hands on his chest. "What kind of explanation, Beth? That you bought me some kind of magic pen that predicts murders?" That cannot be it, she said. What if it is? He asked. What if that's what's happening? What do I do? Beth sat back down and rubbed her slender chin. After a few moments, she looked up at him. If that is what's happening, if you really think the pen is warning you of these murders before they happen, then you have to try and help. Help how? You have to let the pen tell you about the next murder in your story, and then you have to call the police. Tell them what's going to happen. They might think you're crazy, but you have to try. He thought about her words, pacing back and forth for several minutes before he nodded in agreement. Okay, if the pen wants to tell me what's happening, then I'll go to the police and tell them what I can. No, she said, and gripped his hand. We'll go together. They spent a nervous day watching news reports, both factual and speculative, about the two murders. There was nothing useful, mostly a lot of conjecture and comparisons of the previous murders attributed to the same killer. As it grew dark, Kevin looked over at his desk. You should go to bed, he said as he stood and walked towards where the pen was waiting in its box. If anything happens, I'll come get you. Okay, she said, and kissed her first two fingers and pressed them to the corners of his mouth. After he was gone, he looked at the pen for a long time before picking it up. He sat, with his hand poised to begin writing in the notebook, but nothing happened. No ideas came to him. The story did not follow the pen as it had previously. He sat back in his chair and turned the pen between his fingers. Perhaps it really was coincidence, he thought. Perhaps he was just overtired and making false connections where there was nothing to connect. At some way station in his train of thought, he dozed off. He awoke, eyes bleary and neck stiff, with his chin on his chest and the pen sitting loose in his hand. He was about to stand, to go and crawl into bed next to his wife, when he looked down at the notebook and saw there were fresh pages filled with writing. He read the story, crafted in the arching style the pen seemed to give him, that he had no memory of writing. The detective was on a frantic hunt for the killer and tracked him through the city, following a series of clues that had been carefully placed where the detective would find them. The clues, after leading him on one long chase, led to the detective's own house. Terrified for his family, the detective burst through the door of his home. Everyone was dead, cut and mutilated, his entire family gone. The detective searched through the house, looking for the killer, until he came to the bedroom. There, on the mirror, in the blood of his slain family, were the words, "You've always known my name." And the detective looked down at his own face in the mirror and realized that he was the killer. The blood on his clothing was caked and dry from the murders he committed hours before. The bloody handprints in the house were his. There was a knife in the pocket of his coat with his family's blood on it. All this time, all these years, he had been hunting himself. Kevin turned the page and saw the last few lines of the story were written in red ink. He rubbed his eyes to make sure he wasn't seeing things, and when he pulled his hand away from his face, he saw that it was covered in the same red ink that stained the page in front of him. He stirred from the desk, and as he stood, the light from the desk lamp shone on his shirt and pants, and he saw they were stained. It took him several moments to realize they were not stained with ink. He ran down the hallway to his bedroom. The bed, the floor, the walls were covered in blood. His heart hammering in his chest, Kevin threw back the covers on the bed, but Beth was gone. Where she had lain was only a broad, slick, red stain and a broken mirror. On the biggest piece in the mirror, written in tall, arching letters, were the words, "Now I know your name." The end. That creeped me out when I wrote it a number of years ago, and I hope you guys found it creepy too. Thanks for being with me. I really appreciate it.